per minute for that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Arnold for the first hour.
Okay, it's nice to be here, and I had more fun this week putting up the display in the hall and getting things together, sort of reliving many of the things that I've collected, and of course reliving the years that I've worked at Talbert Trailers. I started with Mr. Talbert in 1946 in the Chicago area, and I might get into some of those details a little later. I think you'll get a chuckle out of some of them. But it's been a lot of fun, and I've been more or less a truck nut all my life. And it's only through God's grace that I've been able to do this. And I thank him for all the opportunities that I've had throughout my life. And I also want to acknowledge two of my children are here tonight, and my sainted wife for all the years that they put up with me, because the truck part never got out of the family. It was always there one way or another. And I guess in the long run it's what provided for us all those years, and it has always been interesting as far as I'm concerned. I was born and raised in Chicago, and about 2 miles east of Midway Airport. And why I didn't want to become a pilot, I'll never know. But trucks always seemed a lot closer. They were right down there on the street level. And my dad, he would shake his head when he'd say, "What do you want to think about a truck for?" He worked in a coal yard. He was a common laborer, and the only thing he ever saw in a truck was a chain drive Mack truck that had 5 tons of coal on it, and they dump it on the street, and you had to wheel it into the house. So because Dad said don't do it, I think that's why I kept at it. But I didn't. I thought at one time I wanted to be a truck driver, and in those days, if you wanted to be a truck driver, I think there was something wrong, because the equipment that they had and everything else wasn't anything like it is today. It is just one of those things that I latched onto, and I was encouraged by several people. I used to go around to different dealerships in Chicago asking for literature and pictures, and so they'd give me all the culls, anything they didn't want. Well, I didn't realize it, but I never threw any of it away, and today they're collector's items. And 2 gentlemen, one was a Mack truck salesman by the name of Jim Hegarty, and another one was Ed Hendrickson of Hendrickson Motor Truck. And they said, just, if you're interested, just keep it up, because it's an industry that's here to stay. And then after that, I met Mr. Talbert. And we'll get into a little bit of that later about my meeting with him, because that's really a good one. Talbert, as it is today, a lot of people, one gentleman here, Mr. Teskey, he said, I used to have people that worked out at Talbert's tell me what they did, and he said, I always thought they were stretching it a little. He said, but after I've seen pictures and heard a little more, he said, I guess you did build items that were that big and did such fantastic things. Located on a 22-acre site 4 miles east of Rensselaer at the fantastic location that's called Pleasant Ridge. Even when I came here, there was nothing at Pleasant Ridge. And maybe there are some people here that remember when there used to be a store or something else at Pleasant Ridge. But it is a high spot, and you can see town from there on a clear day. And of course, if it's icy out, you can notice it on the grade if you have to get to work in the morning. And it houses all of our engineering, purchasing, production, And at the present time, there's 220 employees there. It's the largest number of employees we've had in our history. And the tradition of excellence in design and application and engineering and customer service in this heavy hauling field continues today as it has in the past. When we first came to Rensselaer, people used to call us and they want to buy a house trailer. They want to buy a boat trailer. They thought we were in Indiana, and because of the Elkhart area with house trailers and travel trailers, they thought that's what we built. Under the guidance of Davies Wakefield, our president, we've done some fantastic things as far as production and using the plant facilities to the maximum. And if it wasn't for that, I don't think we would keep up with the demand that's out there today, because the backlog is well into what month now? Into August of this year, and in our industry, that's quite fantastic. Now, in the regular dry freight trailer business, that's another story. They're out like 12 to 18 months. But the trucking industry in the last 2 years has enjoyed a great market. And it's not only stateside, some of it is foreign, but the biggest percentage is through dealers and customers. And we have always strived to build a reliable piece of equipment for the heavy hauler. And people that aren't in the industry, they don't understand what this trailer does. It has to handle the bulldozer, the crane, the heavy equipment that has to be moved, and heavy machinery that has to be moved in. And maybe you've seen the power plant here that had engines put in. And when they bring them from the railroad on a trailer over and put in a 100-ton piece of equipment or so, it's quite a job to have that equipment handle it. And we've always emphasized working with the customer, because the customer knows what his need is in the area that he's working in. And if you think the United States are united as far as laws for trucking, that's not the rule. All these states still have their own rules. Many of them are mandated to do certain things because of the federal highway program, but there's many other things that do not apply. So we have to meet with the customers, understand what they need, where they're operating, and together we design and produce a vehicle for them to use. And the other part is service after the sale and doing modification work, and we've had a site over at Francisville, and that's where that work is done. Because with changing laws, we lengthen trailers to suit and repair them, and other various add axles on them, whatever is required. And then the most recent addition to our production facility is north of Parr. And out of that building, we produce the step deck, or the typical highway type trailer. It isn't a low bed type trailer. It's more of an over the highway type. And the square footage out here at Pleasant Ridge is like 53,000 square foot, which is a pretty good facility. And most of that addition to the site was because of the 150 trailers that we produced for the time during Desert Storm. We had to produce them fast. We had to increase the facilities. We had to do many things. And with that experience, it's helping us today with our production of what we learned at that time, having sub-assemblies made outside and so on and so forth. So it's through the years, Mr. Talbert, he was the type of person that he was like a natural-born mechanic. He could look at something and size it up and figure out what had to be done. Except when some of the new steels come in, and you maybe could use half the steel and still be as strong, it sort of threw things out of kilter because you couldn't look at it anymore. You had to use a little more of an engineering approach to it. But still, he come up with designs, and I can remember when I first started working for him, I had to make some drawings, and he'd tell me what he'd like to see laid out, and before I had it done, he'd already got 3 steps ahead of me and how he wanted it changed. But that's how his mind worked, and that's how he was. And he never had the idea or the goal to be a mass producer. He would not be able to handle the situation that's going on today. There's no way. That's just the type of person he was, but it was through his efforts and his ideas that, you know, the company was established and carried on today. He depended on many people that he gleaned information from. I think he took the advice that he wanted and then he sort of channeled them the way he wanted to use them. But he had a knack to use people and find out what their thoughts were and try to put them all together and put out a product or accomplish a task that was put before him. And he was born in LaGrow, Indiana. How many people know where LaGrow is at? It's over near Fort Wayne on 24. 14. What is it? 14. Is it 14? Okay. And he operated a wrecker service around the Elkhart area, but while he was in high school over in the LaGrow area, he was selling bicycle tires and batteries, and he was selling, he's always been in something. And he operated this wrecker service and became acquainted with many of the cross-country truck people and towed different vehicles into Chicago, and I think that's how he got to Chicago. And when he did go into the Chicago area, he worked for Material Service Corporation. Now they're a big conglomerate that had coal mines, quarries, ready-mix plants, and all that kind of job work. And his job was to set and move heavy crusher equipment, and that's where he built his first trailer in 1938. And from that time on, he never stopped. He got into a construction equipment business. He did heavy hauling. He did crane rental. He did everything that had to do with the construction industry or the heavy equipment erecting and moving. And some of the items that are in the showcase out here in the hall, you can see the first trailer that he built, and that trailer at the present time has got a couple trees growing up through it on the south side of Chicago, and Davies Wakefield, our president, still thinks we ought to resurrect it, but I haven't taken him up there yet to show it to him because it is quite a rusty hulk. And then the other thing was that the company grew rapidly after he made trailers for his own use, and he had competitors that wanted to buy a trailer from him. But then after he did build trailers for the competitors started saying, well, if you're in heavy hauling, why should I buy a trailer from you? So then he got out of the hauling business and dedicated all of his efforts to the production of trailers. And the site up in Lyons, Illinois, west of Chicago, became too small. And I guess because he was born in Indiana, had some idea that he would like to relocate down here. And probably everybody in this room thinks that, well, he relocated Rensselaer and that was the first step and that was it. Well, that's not true. The first site that was picked was on Route 16, west of Monon, where the railroad angles across and 16 is here, and he bought the parcel of property at a good price. He didn't have any contractor. He was doing his own work. He had a drag line in there and was ditching and putting tile in, and for every 3 tile they put in the ground, they could only see 1. It was quicksand. It was good farming ground, but once you got through the first 3 or 4 foot, the rest of it wasn't worth building a plant on. So that was canceled, and I guess he sold it back at a reduced price to whoever he bought it from and came to Rensselaer. So that's how he got to Rensselaer. I think he had looked at a couple sites, and probably Rensselaer was a little more costly or something. I'm sure that was the reason at the time. And then that's how we got to Pleasant Ridge. And the thing that astounded everybody was how close the rock was to the surface at Pleasant Ridge. There was a little bit of blasting that had to be done for certain installations out there. And so everything continued along, and when the site in Chicago area in Lyons, Illinois got too small, that's why he came down to Rensselaer, and he continued a dealership in Chicago and still sold our product and some other products up there. And then in 1975, he sold the complete holdings of everything to a holding company in New York City. And at the beginning, the holding company was made up of a French and a Spanish and another gentleman that was in New York. And eventually, the Spanish and the French interests were bought out, and it is all in the hands of the one holding company in New York. But the name has always been there. It's been operating under that name all the time. And then as time went on, things were advanced where some of the foreign sales were made, dealerships were increased, and the product was getting more well known, and of course the business grew. And the thing that we know in the industry today is that there are so many low-bed trailer manufacturers out there now compared to what there was back in the 1940s that it's unbelievable. But still, all of them are thriving. It's just hard to understand how it happens, but that's what's happening today. What I'd like to do is show you this video. You'll have to bear with some of the sales pitch in it because it's the best that I have to offer you. So it won't be of interest maybe as far as that part goes, but it will show the product and what we are at crawled over the back end and it was dangerous, and that's the whole lot. I realize that if you're not in this kind of business, you know, a low-bed trailer is going down the road with a crawler crane on it or a loader of some type, you can't hardly see the trailer. All you see is the load going by. So that that is the product, and you heard the history behind it, and basically that's the history of Talbert trailers. What was interesting to me is that while working for Mr. Talbert, I always picked up bits of advice from him. Like one was, keep your mouth shut and your ears open. I would go to lunch with him with customers, and people thought that I was his son. I don't know if it was because I had a receding forehead at that time or whatever, but some people would call me Arnold Talbert. Well, I didn't mind. The pay was the same. And honestly, I learned a lot, and I met a lot of interesting people. I met one gentleman at Material Service Corporation, and at one lunch hour I found out how you load a barge. Well, so what's in a barge? Well, if you start loading the barge in the center with what material you have, it'll break in half. You load it from one end, and you load it down into the water from end to end. Big deal. But these are all the things that happen, you know, as you're in an industry. And another one, a very well-respected rigging and heavy hauler from the state of California, Mr. Talbert had been trying all the time to get him to come to Lyons, Illinois and look at our product and sell something that he could use in California. Well, when he did come there, Mr. Talbert said, Arnold, I want you to take Henry Biggie down to the Stevens Hotel. And for you youngsters, that's the Conrad Hilton. It was built by the gentleman by the name of Steve Healy, and that's how it got to be the Stevens Hotel in the 1920s. But I thought, well, fine, I'll get to drive Mr. Talbert's car downtown and take this gentleman down. And then I started thinking, well, why wasn't he wanting to wine and dine this gentleman? You know, he's trying to get him there for years and that. And so the day went on, and I said, do I have to gas your car up or that? He said, no, you're going to take him in your car. Whoa. Here's this man with his double-breasted suit on. They were in style back then, too. And so he introduced me to Mr. Biggie, and he said, well, Al, he said, I understand you're going to be my chauffeur. This was 1947. I had a 1937 Lafayette. If you don't know what a Lafayette is, it was a forerunner of a Nash. Maybe you don't know what a Nash is. But anyway, sure enough, I chauffeured him downtown, and Arnold was just feeling so proud that I was able to chauffeur Mr. Henry Biggie, and anybody in our industry that ever knew anything about the industry knew what a gentleman he was and how well respected he was. But like Mr. Talbert, Mr. Biggie was down to earth, and they were able to talk with the nobody like Arnold, or talk to the large contractors, the bankers, and they were just all-around type people. Another thing about Mr. Talbert, when you used to see him walk in the office, he never wore a tie. He always, if he was dressed up, he wore a Western type tie, you know, the cord. And if you saw him come to work all dressed up, he either had a customer coming or he was going to the bank to borrow money. And these are some of the things that I recall and have fun recalling because they were interesting. But the most interesting thing of all is, as a kid of about, well, I was 16 years old, and I had watched this one Army surplus truck. It was a 10-ton Army-rated truck, so that meant you could haul at least 30 ton on it. And Mr. Talbert had it as a truck tractor and had built a trailer to go with it. And it had a 3,500 Manitowoc on it going through Chicago. And in the crane industry, a Manitowoc crane of that size is like 60 to 75 ton if it isn't all rigged out. It'd be more than that. And when you're standing on the curb and you see this thing go by, you know, nowadays you stand on the expressway or on the interstate and you see it at a distance, but in those days there weren't any major highways like that. They were right there in front of you. And all I saw was Talbert, and I saw Lyons, Illinois on the door, and neither one meant anything to me. I didn't even know where Lyons, Illinois was from where I lived in Chicago. But I made sure I looked on the map, and I told my dad about it because he had been born and raised on the west side of Chicago. And so I found out where it was, and I got on my bicycle. 16-year-old guys in high school didn't have a car then. You took the streetcar if it was in the city limits. Well, this was out of the city, so it was a 7-mile ride out to where Mr. Talbert was at, and I thought, I'll go out there and I'll get a closer look and take some pictures. In those days, if I had enough money for the film, I would borrow my Aunt Minnie's camera. And then I'd go take the picture. And Aunt Minnie is still living. It's not a fictitious name. She's 91 years old, or will be 91 this year. She was 90 last year. Always had a soft spot in her heart for Arnold, and I could take that camera any place I wanted. You know, one of those Kodaks that would pull out and extend. Took good pictures. I get out to Lyons, Illinois, and I go in the yard. There's one of the workers or somebody feeding a watchdog out there, and there's one trailer in the yard. There's no trucks out there, there's nothing. They're all out working. So this trailer was brand new, painted, had 3 axles on the back. And you have to understand that back in the 40s, if you saw 2 axles together on a trailer, that was a big rig. This thing had 3. So I went in and talked to this fella, and he said, yeah, he said, it's some new idea that Talbert just built, you know. So I got the camera out there to take a picture, and there's a person storms out of the office, and he has a few choice words and says, get out of here and don't come back. Who you spying for? And I left on my bicycle. So I went back 2 weeks later with an armful of material I had collected and pictures and literature, and I was determined to go back and prove to whoever that guy was that I wasn't spying. Well, it so happened it was Mr. Talbert, and I walked in the office, and he sat where he could see everybody walking in, and I'm talking to the lady out in front. She was his dispatcher, she was the bookkeeper, she did everything. And I said, well, I'd like to see that man there because I recognized him. And she said, well, that's Mr. Talbert. Do you have an appointment? I said, no. And by that time, he overheard what was going on, and he said, send him in. So he was talking to his shop foreman, and I went in there, and I said, well, I just come back to show you I wasn't spying. And I showed him what I had, and I had, of course, I was going into my 4th year mechanical drawing at the school where I was going, so I had some drawings with them. He said, you know what? He said, we could use somebody like you. He said, we've been building about 3 trailers a month, and he said, we don't have any drawings. He said, we check to see what steel we've got and what we need and what we can work with and so forth. And he said, then I've got a couple guys that come back and wanted one just like last time. He said, that got erased off the shop floor, you know. So my first job was 85 cents an hour, and I had to draw the trailer up after it was built. Now that was sort of like engineering in reverse. We still do some of that today, Dan? But anyway, that's got to be one of the most interesting things, and the 85 cents an hour wasn't too interesting. And I worked during Christmas holiday and Thanksgiving holiday and Saturdays, and all the time I was hitchhiking from the city limits, I didn't have a car. This was in my into my last year of high school. So along comes Mr. Talbert one day and he said, I think you should have a car. And my mind is a little hazy of what happened first, but I think I had quit on him once before he offered to buy the car. And of course I didn't have enough guts to talk to him in person and say I was quitting. He was away on a fishing trip, and I left him a note and said that I wasn't going to be working there anymore. Didn't tell him why. And I got a job in a Walgreen warehouse closer to home for $1.25 an hour. I was lugging cases, doing something. My mother and dad didn't have a telephone in those days. We used a neighbor's telephone. So he drove to the house and he said, Mrs. Braasch, he said, why did Arnold quit? He said, I thought he'd like doing this thing, you know. And she said, oh, I don't know. She said, you know, these kids and whatever. So he said, well, you tell him to come back. So I went back out and saw him on a Saturday, and he said, well, what do you think you're worth? And I said, $1.25 an hour, and he hired me back, and I worked for him ever since. So, is it time for a break? Okay. Well, on that light note, I guess we're going to take a break, and what is the schedule then? What do we do?
Refreshments are out in the other room, and you can't bring them in the main library, okay?
Okay. Okay. I don't mind mentioning who the customer was that got stung, was Maddox. And they were hauling a drag line on it. And they went around the corner with this brand new trailer that they had bought, they thought cheaper than buying one from us. And they almost lost the whole load out in the county roads because the guy had put an air suspension on for him and he hadn't put any regulators on it. And there was no way to control that air system. And when he went around the corner, one side went up, the other side went down and almost lost the load. So he brought it into us. And a guy comes running in the office. He said, Arnold, you won't believe it. He said, there's a trailer out there that's just like ours. And he said, somebody else made it. And then what Judge McGraw told you is the rest of the story. And then later on, that ended up being in the property of one of the local banks. And one of the particulars at the bank called up and they said, we'd like to have somebody from your company go out and have you bid on this trailer. And I said, is it this, and this? And he said, yeah. I said, sorry, that's all yours. We don't want anything to do with it. The whole idea is when somebody copies something, either they cease and desist, and in the case of the removable gooseneck, they'd have to weld it up and not use it, or else pay us a fee to be able to use it. And that's how things normally work. But I'll tell you, today, a lot of that stuff is all gone by the board. A lot of the patented, unless it's highly technical in electronics and everything else, nowadays people don't even think it's worthwhile getting it, and it's only because of those legal fees those guys charge. It costs so much to maintain a patent that it's ridiculous. Once you have it, anytime you hear about somebody that's doing something that's like that patented feature, well then you have to go after them, because if you don't, then the next time somebody does it, you can't bother with it because you let somebody get by with it. Frank Zickman asked me one thing. He said, you didn't mention anything about the dump trailers Talbert built. Well, that isn't what Talbert's known for. We used to build dump trailers. And we built some fantastic dump trailers too. They were heavy ones, big ones, all types. The first ones that Mr. Talbert built had about a 14 to 16 yard body. They're straight dump trucks nowadays that have bigger bodies than that, and that was a trailer back then. And the thing about trailer laws in Indiana and Illinois and anything east of the 10 western states, in the 40s and 50s, you were able to run 4 axles on a trailer and 45 feet long, tractor and trailer. We got trailers nowadays that are 50-some feet long, the trailer alone. So a lot of laws have changed over the years, and the more the laws change, the more product we'll be able to sell because they become outdated, and on you go. I guess that's a progressive way to look at it. What I would like to do is share with you a few things. They might have led you to believe that I was going to tell you about some other company histories, but my forte is really Talbert and trucking history in general. But a couple of the companies around here, like in the Remington area and DeMott area and Rensselaer, you know, there's many, many trucks being used. Remington Freight Lines, Smith Transport, Schilly is a big one, and Schilly is part of a family that has bigger operations, St. Louis and so forth. Satellite Trucking, you might have seen some of their rigs. I think they've got like 50 rigs on the road. Kyle Trucking out west of Rensselaer. Trucking is something that is in a lot of people's blood. They want to be a truck driver and a truck operator. And some make it, some don't. Then up in the DeMott area, you have Belstra Trucking, and then Hamstra, some different entities. The Hamstra do a lot of trucking. And then everything that if you have it, it come by truck. When you stop and think about it, that's the way it is. It just, it don't get to you any other way. Farm Bureau, any service companies, the oil or the gas that comes to your house, it all comes by truck. This is what everybody in the trucking industry used to promote. That was the fight the railroads. Nowadays, the trucks are hooked on the railroad and part of the railroad, not fighting each other. They're all taking advantage of each other however they can in the overall scheme of things. And some of the historical things that I remember when I first came to town, or I could back up when I was maybe just a sophomore in high school. I had a friend in Chicago where his dad owned 2 or 3 trucks, and he hauled groceries for Royal Blue Store. And one time I worked as a helper in the summertime, and I came all the way to Rensselaer, Indiana, out of Chicago, and I thought that was really far out. Because there wasn't any I-65, that's for sure. You were either, when it used to be called 53 coming down here instead of 231, or 41 or whatever, and when 41 used to be right on the doorstep of the store or the house in Morocco. And then when we did come to Rensselaer, I was asking Beulah, but she didn't remember for sure that Homer Hendrickson's store was a Royal Blue Store, but I thought that was the Royal Blue Store. Is that right? Okay. Because you had to go up a couple steps and into the store. Well, so many of those different entities all happened and went by the board, I guess from 57 to 60. Because after we were here a few years, then those places weren't around anymore. And Chamberlain Ice Cream, I don't know if they were still here in the 60s or if they were out in the late 50s. All of these names. And another confusing thing is when we came to town, there was a Talbert Schwab Lumber Company. And if you don't think that was confusing with the post office, it'd be Talbert Lumber Company and not the second name maybe, and we'd get the mail. And in those days when we first got here, you had the switchboard operator in town. Now, she used to be able to filter some of them because she knew who normally called. And she'd say, oh, you don't want that one, you want the other one. So these are some of the interesting things I remember, not being a native, and people always told me is after you were here 25 years or so, you might get accepted. Well, we've been here a little longer than that, so I assume we're accepted. Made a lot of friends and so forth. But what I'd like to do is show you a video that I think you'll enjoy because it has some local humor type stuff in it, and it also would be meaningful, and you can understand what trucking used to be like in the old days after wagons and the horse were kind of outdated. So I'd like to show you that. This is called Wooden Wheels and Solid Tires because trucks were first solid tires before they were pneumatic. I'm real happy to say that I know these gentlemen personally, not the narrator, but the ones that were in the movie. The one gentleman talking about the two-colored truck, if you ever get near him, you can't get away. He tells stories and never tells the same story twice. His dad and his grandfather were wagon builders, and he still, or his sons I guess are in it now, they still build truck bodies. And they've been in that work all those years in Philadelphia. The other gentleman on there that had the suit coat on and the open collar, he was the editor for 40 years for Commercial Car Journal, which was the magazine, it was a standard of the industry. In fact, it was the only one that was in the industry back in the 20s and into the 30s, and then other magazines started popping up. But it did more for the trucking industry than just advertise products. It did cover stories of interest and so forth. And that gentleman became the editor of our American Truck Historical Society, and he developed this magazine which we put out every 2 months. And for anybody that's a truck nut or interested in trucking in general, it's devoted to historical truck, not current trucks. And what we do in this society is try to maintain truck history because so much stuff has been thrown out in the dumpster. A trucking company goes out of business, a husband dies, the wife throws the stuff out the door, and we're trying to retrieve that material and keep it. We have an office in Birmingham, Alabama. We have some 200,000 negatives down there and many, many books. And we do everything we can to collect this material and have it for the future. I was confronted in 1970 by a gentleman. He called out at Talbert one day and he said, you wrote a note and addressed it to me that you were surprised to hear a story or somebody writing a book about trucking. And he said, we're starting this historical society, and he said, we need a youngster like you. I was 40 and the rest of them in the group were 60. Well, here I am, you know. But it's been interesting in that society, and I've met many friends and have them all over the country. And again, like in business, when you meet people that can talk to the lowly worker or the person that doesn't have a lot to say or doesn't have a lot of means compared to talking with somebody that is in a higher place. I sit next to guys and are friends with them, and they've got like 60, 70 antique trucks they restored. And if anybody has any idea what it costs to restore automobiles or trucks these days, those guys are millionaires in their own right, but there they are with their set of jeans on and just talking with you, and they're just happy to share that with you, even though they have all of that in their own possession. Some of them have private museums of their own. Some are nice enough to let you see them, and others are particular. say, don't bring your little kids with, you know, and stuff like that. And it's sad when that happens because those kids are the ones that we would like to impress and show them, you know, what is being done and what can be done. But you have to bear with them. There's all types and all kinds. Talking about all types and all kinds, in and around Rensselaer, I tried to make a habit of, anytime I heard somebody talk about trucks, I'd find out if they were a driver or had worked with trucks. Well, I don't know if it was at a wedding or at some get-together, I just happened to get next to Mr. Teskey, and I found out that he drove for an automobile carrier and drove for Gateway Transfer and retired after 31 years in that as a Teamster. We have Glenn Kingman that hasn't driven for a number of years. He drove for J.A. Grant for quite a few years. And Paul Cochran, if you wondered what happened to him, well, just look at the Hicks Gas tractor trailer that runs around town here and services other Hicks Gas locations. At 71, he still enjoys driving the truck. He doesn't drive in the summer. He just drives in the gas season, either the corn drying or the heating season when the large quantities of gas are in demand. And little did I know that he drove for Daily Express years ago, which is a customer of ours that has many of our trailers on the road hauling heavy equipment. But I found that out by talking to him here a couple of weeks ago. He used to haul out of Peoria over to some of the dealerships in the Midwest. And then Wayne Bratner, he drives for White Castle and used to drive for J.A. Grant. And he said, too bad White Castle wasn't around here years ago. He said, things would have been fantastic. He said, it's such a pleasure driving the equipment and working for the company as compared to some of the hard miles that he drove for the other concerns. And Curly Bachman, if any of you know him, I don't know his whole history, but he has retired again, or finally, from White Castle. He drove for them for a number of years, but had been driving before that. And I remember he used to have a single drive axle white tractor and a single axle cattle trailer parked out by his house. And anytime I'd go by there, I'd wonder who lived there. Well, it was later on when my daughter Sue went to school with one of his daughters, and I found out who owned that cattle trailer. And of course, it looked like such a small rig, but in the early days, it was a big rig. And then another party, some of you might have known Bill Stadton of this age. He's 50-something and did work out at Talbert's. Well, his dad was a driver. He transferred all the material, our steel and everything, from Lyons down here to Rensselaer. I don't know if he was a senior or how that all fell in line, but he drove for us for quite a few years, and there were a couple other drivers, but the only other one that I recall being there any length of time is Bob or Ajax Sanders. And he retired and lives down in Mobile, or down in Alabama, someplace down there. And he drove cross-country for years before he came to us, drove for Steel Hauler and so forth, and then drove trailers for us. Sam Grant, I don't know how many of you knew Sam, but I only wish the number of times I talked to Sam, I had a recorder. Because I went to him one time and I said, Sam, I got a guy asking me about a contractor that had 6 trucks delivered to him in Rensselaer, Indiana in 1906. He said, I never heard of that name. But he said, let me tell you, he said, the road south of town was paved, but the road north of town still wasn't paved. And he said, it isn't where 231 is now. It was over a ways and north of town where the house that's across from the REMC used to be a stage stop or a hotel out there. And I never recorded any of this, just the little bits I remembered myself. And now Sam has moved to Florida 100%, and I'll probably never get that put down. And you know, Sam was railroaded into the trucking business. He went to Purdue. He wanted to be a horticulturist. His dad and family conditions were such that they needed the help in the business, and he got into it, and he said, I got into it at the right time. Things worked. We made money. We bought equipment, and that's how he got in the trucking business. It wasn't that he liked trucks. He would have rather been working with the plants. And the other person I remember, and correct me if I have the name wrong, Ray Shoup, the Railway Express man. You'd see him either at the station with his Railway Express truck, or you'd see him at the post office mailing in his papers or whatever. And Ray always had a smile, and I can still see him. That's another era that's gone by. When the railroads were in their heyday, that express car was a real meaningful thing on the car. And believe me, we used to go there and just wait for the train to come because we were short some parts, and we were waiting for him to come on that train from out of Chicago going down to Indianapolis. It's sure a lot nicer having UPS come right to the door every day, or FedEx, or whoever else is doing that type of work now. Now, those are some of the individuals, and one other one is Buck Hall. And I haven't had a chance to talk to him, but he's worked for Hopkins for many, many years. Are there any other drivers in the crowd here? Or? Right. Right. I forgot about him. Oh, Bull Robinson. Right.
I want to bring in something about trucks. Route 30 was the first transcontinental highway, coast to coast. And I don't think you brought that out, but you said it with your trucks. I'd like to bring out something else with me. Mr. Talbert, I remember built those two houses in the Farrell Road in Union Township. They built the houses, put the furnace in, and then he took the bearings out because it made too much noise, the blowers. That's silent bearings. I don't know where he got them in both houses out there. And one more thing I want about Mr. Talbot. You remember, they decided they wanted a Cadillac franchise here at Rensselaer, and it become available, so they bought it. That's where Towner Motors is now, or Ferguson Motors is. Also, now, you haven't brought that out, and I think this is that.
And he sold TVs, and wherever there was a dollar to be made, Mr. Talbert was happy to look into it. He was a very enterprising individual. I'll tell you another venture. I probably shouldn't let too many of these cats out of the bag, but the property where I live now, he had purchased 240 acres out there. And it wasn't until years later that I knew why he purchased them. He thought he had the inside track of where I-65 was going in. And it was only about 10 acres of the 240 that became I-65. The rest of it stayed in the property. He wanted a piece of property one time, and I remember a trailer got traded for that piece of property. Here from the IRS. He was quite an enterprising individual. I'll have to tell it. When Tim Eager worked up at U.S. Steel, Mr. Talbert had been friends with him, and he wanted a piece of tubing. And so the piece of tubing got here, and then did you go to see him? Oh, about the payment for it. Yeah. Yeah. He told Tim to go to the bank. He said, just tell him that's how much you want and they'll give it to you, you know. Because he had his property in a trust fund and the bank was administering that and, you know, all of these details. But anyway, the industry itself is the trucking industry. If it was not for these individuals, the drivers, the people that strive to build the equipment, I'm sure it wouldn't be where it's at today. And that's one of the things that we strive to remember in our historical society is that it is a group of people, not just the equipment out there. Another colorful individual that I remember, not having to do with driving, but that would be Bill Babcon. When we first moved down here, we didn't have a warehouse of supplies. You know, we were piecemealing things, and if you didn't find it at can't think of his last name right now. Harris's hardware store. Warner. If you couldn't find it at Harris Warner's store, you went over to Bill Babcock and you looked underneath the scale house. That's where the bolts and the nuts and all this stuff was. And what was the gentleman's last name by the name of Whitey that worked in the machine shop? Whitey Williams. Okay. I remembered a couple times he helped us out by doing something for us, machining or making something for us to get a job out. When we first started out there, it was in August of '57. The roof wasn't all on yet. And of course in the month of August it does rain. There were a few welders that were getting shocks and so forth, but trailers did start going out the door, and eventually at the end of '57 the plant got completed. I guess I could go on and on telling you these little bits and pieces, but it's been a pleasure recalling them myself, and I hope it was of interest to you and about Talbert and about the trucking industry in general. Thank you.
The history of trucks and trucking doesn't really lie in any books. It's scattered in a million heads, picture albums, garages, junkyards. Once upon a time, these old wrecks were proud and strong. They were the business end of a lifeline of products and services reaching across the country. And all around them were life, people making a living. Drivers, dispatchers, mechanics, storekeepers, longshoremen, gas jockeys, and even waitresses. You know, there's a place where these babies still gleam as they ride high in the noonday sun. A place where kids still grin from ear to ear to see them go by. That place is in our hearts, in our imaginations.
It all started with a need, a timeless need to move goods from place to place quickly and cheaply. freight was hauled by wagons then. Crude contraptions made of wood, honchoed by the drivers, carrying goods from factory to railhead, railhead to port, and back again. Wagons were the weakest link in a creaky chain of manufacture and distribution. They were the offspring of the buckboard and the Conestoga wagon, forming a slow and shifting conveyor belt for the materials and goods that built America. Simple in design and operation, they were wire crates with wheels, pulled by teams of horses or mules. As long as loads were light and mileage low, they limped along. They opened our western frontier and carried our armies to the Battle of Gettysburg. Through the years, wagons brought us everything we needed.
All right, one more time today, and that's it.
But meanwhile, the future was taking shape in the strangest places.
All right, how many degrees did we use on the last test?
In 100 barns and sheds, an army of tinkerers worked toward the same simple but brilliant idea: the internal combustion engine. Horsepower in a small mechanical device.
I think this will give us the compression we need. That's perfect.
It was the fuse, igniting an explosion that rearranged the elements of all that was, totally and forever. History's horse and wagon was reborn, with an engine where the horse used to be. Not all of those engines ran on gas. There was steam, and there was electric. In fact, it was the electric truck that made the first real inroads on the wagon's turf.
The market opened and electric trucks were introduced primarily because they could be kept in the same area as where the horse wagon were kept. If you recall seeing pictures, the original electrics were the same size of a horse wagon. In fact, in most cases, they were nothing more than a converted horse wagon. The bodies were identical. The undercarriage was just powered by batteries instead of a horse. They had a traveling speed of probably 7-8 miles per hour and a 10 to 15 mile radius on a small truck. A large truck, if they had real good batteries, you could go 12 miles probably, but it was questionable.
It took time, but gas power won, and everybody was out to build a better truck. These gutbusters were the first steps in a long and hard-fought race, and what a race it was. The motorized wagon was the starter pistol for a gold rush unlike anything the world had ever seen before, or will probably ever see again. When these motor trucks rolled out onto the streets of America for the first time, they set in motion forces that would change the shape of things to come. To look at it back in those days, no one would have guessed what was going to happen later.
As business progressed in the city, the small operator needed transportation for his product to go to other people, whether it was a further manufacturer or a finished product that had to be transported, and he could not afford his own vehicle. So he went to a local drayman, who in those days operated horses and wagons. The horse and wagon and the driver formed a team, is where the term teamster come from. The driver drove the team, and a team could be one horse and one wagon. It did not necessarily mean two horses, but it was a team, the driver and the number of horses. And they were used naturally, locally, within the city.
These teamsters felt the change before anyone else did. It hit them over the head like a baseball bat. The old-timers knew immediately that they were dealing with a different kind of beast. Teamsters became drivers. They made the switch from oat power to gasoline power gladly or sadly, but they made it. There was a lot of new stuff to get used to. There was the handling of fuel, the maintenance of moving parts, the heat, the soot, the smells. The livery stable gave way to Gasoline Alley. There were a lot of new things you could do with these motorized trucks, and once people got used to them, the horse began to fade away. In the early years, not everybody believed that the truck had a future. There were skeptics who liked the old ways best. Tests were conducted pitting gasoline-powered trucks against horse-drawn wagons to see which was cheaper and more powerful. The truck always seemed to win. Its advantages were obvious. Nobody but a railroad man would deny that a farmer was better off shipping his apples by truck. One pickup, one delivery. Reduced handling, middlemen, and costs. But there were still questions about maintenance, availability of fuel, and technical problems that had to be answered. Almost immediately, an industry began to spring up around these new trucks. Trucks attracted industrious hands like a magnet. Mechanics kept busy with the constant need for repairs and the search for new improvements. Carpenters built new bodies to carry new things. And businessmen sat up nights thinking of ways to use them. The machine itself went through many changes, such as the solid rubber tire, the outside chain drive, and the Presto-Light lantern. As crude as these were, they were solid improvements in safety, comfort, and handling for the state-of-the-art commercial carriers of the time. The primitive state of the equipment in the early years limited the truck's range. Haulers were likely to buy trucks made by manufacturers in their own region because it was hard to get them home from anywhere else. There weren't any roads. Mack was popular in New York, auto cars in Philadelphia, and White's in Cleveland. There was big business in local deliveries. Motor trucks were crisscrossing cities and towns at heady speeds of 7 miles an hour. Routine deliveries became a major event. By 1910, 100 truck manufacturers were building 100,000 trucks. Many of them are names we know today. White, Mack, Autocar, and International Harvester, now Navistar. Soon, Ford and Kenworth would join the pack. Names such as Atlas, Sternberg, Maytag Mason, Knox, Loth Jurgens, Service Motor Truck, and Maxwell contributed to the great legacy of the early days, and then took their place in faded memory. With the pioneers' optimism, they printed images of their products on everything from calendars to matchbooks to postcards. Many of these classic trucks survive only here in this very collectible form. Trucking struggled to take off in the years before World War I. A pent-up demand for motor trucks continued to surface, and freight carriers debated the superiority of truck transportation. But by 1912, the 461 registered manufacturers in the United States were voting with their checkbooks to proceed with the great experiment. As the century yawned, a booming economy pushed the development of trucks for all kinds of uses. Commercial opportunities encouraged businessmen to tackle the problems and possibilities of the early trucks all at once. Gearing up for a job that only it could do, a young industry was beginning to grow. To the visionaries and inventors, it was clear that trucks would be the thing that carried the goods to a growing number of customers. And invention, as always, followed the need. The motor truck was pressed into service to do the jobs people wanted done. The truck made sense. its flexibility and efficiency adding to the health and comfort of the American family. But while new uses for the motor truck sprang up every day, there were some obstacles that the best mechanical engineers could not overcome. The poor condition of the nation's roads had come to the government's attention during World War I. In 1919, a young Army captain named Dwight Eisenhower was part of a mission which sent a convoy of military vehicles from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, a trip that could take 62 hours today. Well, through the untracked wilderness of North America, the trip took 62 days. This mission was a real eye-opener. The truck slipped and slid through the thousands of miles of mud, along rocky trails and over narrow, rickety bridges. In fact, many of the bridges had to be rebuilt en route before they would carry the weight of the trucks. It was a spectacle that inspired an urgent mission to establish a national system of roads. Among other things, these roads would be needed by national companies, whose fleets would economize the distribution of their products. The Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company of Akron, Ohio, was one of the first. They wished to prove their large pneumatic tires in actual road service against standard solid tires. And besides, they had product to deliver to their eastern dealers. In the early 20s, many highway associations were starting up all over the country. These volunteer groups believed in the need for roads and tried to lure motorists out of the cities and into the wide open spaces in between. They marked trails through woods, pastures, and prairies with yellow ribbons, painted posts, and simple signs. Would-be drivers were then supplied with crude maps and sets of instructions. Drivers out there between Albuquerque and Alamogordo never guessed that they were really on the road to the future. The future. Everybody wanted one, and the trucking industry adopted it as their own. They had a stake in it, in the very notion of progress, and in the great network of roads, bridges, and tunnels to come. Something that would later be called the infrastructure of America. Relentless development made the truck more feasible for cross-country use and competition with railroads. It was more than just a friendly competition. It was a veritable battle for the best way to deliver the goods.
When you try to say, well, do we want to go by truck or do we want to go by rail, we're talking about different things, because from the very beginning, the railroad's major forte was to get you, say, as short a distance as Philadelphia to New York, 90 miles. And then the truck came along and said, not only can I make it a whole lot easier to make that short 90-mile stretch from door to door delivery than you can on the railroad, having to load at Philadelphia and unload at New York, but I can also serve all the little places along the way.
The marketplace for goods and services demanded ever better, ever bigger, and ever faster trucks. Between 1921 and 1929, there were a flood of patents which resulted in a more flexible and responsive machine. In a whirlwind of change, the dynamics of the business were shifting too. More skills, more men, more pressure, more jobs. The need to improve working conditions while controlling costs brought about a new alliance between companies and their drivers, allowing a young industry to grow and prosper. More drivers with more responsibility. Drivers who had to stay awake for days at a time, hauling somebody's all-important freight from one place to another. Drivers who were on their own, without supervision. drivers who hauled the raw materials and the finished goods alike, watching them turn to wealth as they moved them from place to place. They sailed their ships into an ocean of mud, dust, untrodden prairies, rutted gravel roads, and dark territory, carrying the burden alone. These men and their trucks were on an important mission, crossing a new frontier in the service of American commerce. Trucks were taking on a new role. People liked them, liked their shape and their size. People liked what a truck said about them and their way of life. These were moving, self-propelled machines, nifty gadgets worthy of old Tom Edison himself. They were the American way of life on wheels. A company's truck sent a message. The fact that a company had a truck sent one message, and then the way it looked said even more. It served as a great traveling billboard on which could be seen the logos, artwork, slogans, and other gimmicks used to promote the company or their products.
And the more trucks you had, the more prestigious you were. I recall as a boy in the early 20s, we had a truck that was built in the 15s for a furniture store in the east side Philadelphia. One side was painted white and the other side was painted red. So when he went down the street, people thought it was a truck. When it come back the other way, they thought the guy had two trucks. There was another truck. And this was the man's honest-to-God belief that people thought he had two trucks by painting one side one way and the other side another.
More than ever, America was about the buying and selling and the glorious having of things. Now, the truck was the vehicle which made it all possible. It had become the perfect carrier of goods. And goods was what the American way of life was all about. The truck was an inevitability of history. From its simple beginnings as a motorized wagon, the truck had staked a claim to the American dream. It was a dream that would give rise to a great industry and shape the growth of a country in the decades yet to come. Today, trucks are so much a part of our lives that we barely notice them. We see them everywhere, wait behind them in big cities, cruise with them on interstates, but most of us take them for granted. Yet they are not just the bigger brother of our cars. They are a different thing altogether. Today's modern, streamlined, air-conditioned truck stands in stark contrast to the rugged experiments of the early days. They're gigantic, powerful, quiet, temperature-controlled, computer-aided, satellite-dispatched, and stereophonically serenaded. The truck has come further than anyone ever dreamed it would. From the unpaved roads of yesterday to the superhighways that now stretch out before us, the truck has hauled our freight through the 20th century. But it's more than that. The truck represents American ingenuity and spirit. It says a lot about who we are and where we're going. No matter where the road leads, the truck and the industry it's built will continue.
morning, gentlemen.
Morning, Bill.
Morning.
Bill. Short night. Right.
I need my orange juice.
Or caffeine. Where is it? Here. Oh, I like it.
That hits the spot.
You bet.
Summing up last night's discussion, I think we're all go on the project.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Let's review the points from last night. Ron, can you give us a sales picture?
Sure. You know, sales have been very strong for our new 2- and 3-axle standard production trailers. But we've got to get the word out to our contractors that they get these standard units loaded with features. We put on our hydroneck, Apatong flooring, low-profile tires, bigger and cooler running brakes, front bridge ramp, outriggers. They get a full 22-foot deck length, and they get...
And?
Well, and we cut the price to move them.
We need a sales staff for a product like that?
And our custom units continue to sell well. The 2-axle 35-ton units. We've designed these units for a future 3rd axle, and that's been a real sales plus for us. As our customer's business grows, and the trailer grows with him. The 3-axle 35 to 60-ton units continue to be our most popular trailers. They come standard with the hydroneck, an air ride suspension system, and they're designed for a future 4th axle. Our most popular options on these trailers are the recessed rear bridge cross members, removable rear bridge, connecting ears, and the electrical fittings. Without a doubt, this is America's most popular low-bed trailer. Sales are growing dramatically for the custom spread axle East Coast units. The heavy hauler is constantly battling state regulations, and these units, versatility and spread are a close couple. He gets the lightest possible empty weight and the lowest rear profile. You know, I think our 50 years here of working through these changing state regulations has helped us with the customers. They like our straight answers before we build the trailer. We tell them we can build them lighter, but it reduces the safety factor. It means failure, a short life expectancy. And that's not what the customer really wants.
No. We build them to last. No shortcuts.
That's right.
Speaking of building them, what about manufacturing and operations?
Well, we're using the laser alignment system on the MX missile erector bridges and all our trailers. Our plasma cutting machine is cutting cleaner, and we pioneered the use of 100,000 PSI minimum yield steel over, 30 years ago. We're sandblasting all our trailers for better paint adherence. We've got the best set of craftsmen and steel workers in the country, and they're producing the best trailers and transport systems in the world.
And I wonder how many people realize it, that we built the transporter for the wings for the space shuttle, that the erection bridges for the MX missile systems were built by us for our nation's defense,
or 200-ton units for the Mooney brothers to carry the nuclear reactor pressure vessels, or that we built the Wester freight handler, first California spread axle in '63, or that our trailers are used all over the world, from the North Slopes of Alaska to Saudi Arabia.
I wonder what Austin Talbert would think. 50 years ago, he started all this, building trailers for his own construction company when he wasn't satisfied with what was available on the market.
Then he built and patented the original removable gooseneck. I saw old pictures the other day of how dangerous it was to load the trailers. Amazing.
Austin Talbert laid a great foundation. He gave this company a commitment to engineering that goes on...
That sounds like my cue.
You've got our attention.
Well, in my humble opinion, engineering excellence is the backbone of this company. 50 years of being the leader in engineering. We've always been looking ahead at what we can do to design things better. And it's paid off because we're always first. First with a removable gooseneck. First with a 700-ton schnabel. The Hoffman in 1970 and the Lockwood back in 1971. First with a hydraulic removable gooseneck. First with a Western freight handler. First and only American manufacturer of a hydraulic steering and suspension hauling system for Duncan machinery movers. Well, the point is this. The guy hauling his cherry picker or NASA transporting the shuttle wings, they know Talbert built them to last. We know the kind of abuse these trailers take out in the real world, and our commitment to safety measures means fewer failures, less downtime, that, and better warranties. In a nutshell, a Talbert customer is a repeat customer. The California system is no different. We're committed to engineering.
Then we're go.
We'll go.
You bet.
Absolutely.